And today we are going to talk about shared language. Basically, I've been working for 3 years before coming to Barcelona in Hotel Beds Group. We were more than 200 developers and designers, and we didn't have any design system. Each team were doing the things they wanted, and so we really needed one. So basically, we find, oops, one moment. We tried to find a solution for all of us, and it was mainly taking the the ideas from three gurus like Brad Frost. The atomic design for the shared language is really easy to understand for developers, designers, especially for all the school visual designers who develop everything in pages. From pages to patterns, this is a great article in Alista Part, who defines, they define in that article how to stop thinking in pages, create visual patterns, not the regular components of we do, just taking the literal visual patterns and try to find the repetitions in the entire UI. And CSS architecture. We try to modify our CSS architecture to find a solution for all of us. Atomic design. Atomic design from Brad Frost is a methodology for creating design systems. Basically, he tried to find a biological solution for atoms, molecules, organisms in a UI. It's like find, okay, this is a little piece of code, this is a bigger element, and if we mix some elements into it, we can find organisms. Atoms can be, for example, labels, inputs, buttons, the classic CTA. Molecules can be combined with different atoms. We did a modification. Brad Frost always says not to include a molecule into a molecule, but we allowed that. It's really easy to find a molecule and define that first and then repeat it again. Organisms, for example, the classic header of any page. Visual patterns. Of course, pages, that doesn't mean anything in this context. I think no one is longer doing CSS or UIs only thinking in pages. Everyone is trying to reuse modules, CTAs, settings like the colors or the same drop-down in the entire web. So we were talking a lot in Hotel Beds in the three different approaches we could do. The first one, of course, we didn't want it, is the pages, because it's really, the UI is really inconsistent. If you have one designer doing a new page, it's a new project for him. He's always doing like the things he really wanted, not a good UI. It's not reusable because, okay, if, for example, you have a card and you are nesting the CSS there from the page, is a mess. It's not reusable, no maintainable, no scalable. The product or content-related components, it's easy to use if you only have one product. But in Hotel Beds, we have hotels, activities, transfers, car hire, a lot of products, and we were using more or less the same cards. So it's consistent, but for example, using a media card, the classic image with a title is repeating the text, the CSS over and over again. It's reusable, but not enough, and the code was repeated too much times. So finally, we did the same approach as the From Pages to Patterns article. we only cared about visual patterns. It's data agnostic. We don't the naming. We don't care about the content we are going to put into it. Based on the structure and patterns, is reusable, maintainable, and scalable. First of all, to do this, we need to involve the entire team, not only the UX designer who's doing this, the UI developer. The entire team should be involved to create the naming of the UI, because the design will be much more consistent, much more flexible and robust, and it's going to be easily to reuse. Okay, this is from Harry Roberts. He says about modularization. It has to start in the design stage, because it's really hard to modularize all the non-design, non-modular thinking. It happened a lot in my previous company because we were always doing the UI, other guy doing the CSS, and they didn't match at all at the end. Of course, there's always some custom project level CSS. You can't do everything on the design and define, okay, this is the title for this element, but the CSS can be a little bit different. So we did this a lot. Spot similarities, create similarities in the design, cut everything, all the pieces of the UI, and trying to make similar become the same. About CSS architecture, basically is IT CSS from Harry Roberts, but adding the atomic design in the middle of it. Well, the CSS didn't have any structure. We had backend developers doing CSS, frontend developers doing CSS, visual designers who didn't do before CSS doing CSS. So it was a mess. It was really hard to modify something and don't break some other part of the UI. It was product related and page related, depending on the developer was different. HTML, IDs, and JavaScript dependent. It was really hard. More than 200 developers putting the hands-on code on it. And if you modify something, even the JavaScript, for example, an QA class breaking the JavaScript. That's really weird. It was really inconsistent and scalable, and of course expensive, because each time we put the hands-on code, it was breaking everything. Daniel Eden says, who usually writes CSS are engineers who hate CSS, who don't know how to write it correctly, and who write a lot of CSS. That happened a lot there, so we try to fix that. Finally, we did something on that. we did just an entire team for UX UI development. So not a single backend developer put hands on that code, or everything was on our side. People will write more CSS than solve the current problems. Is it right? Incorrect CSS. And okay. So finally, what we did with the CSS. First of all, BEM. Probably most of you know something about BEM. Namespacing. It's really nice to have, and if you have a class, just have a namespace before it to say, okay, this is a molecule, this is a part of the layout, this is an atom. And at the end, ITCSS plus atomic design. BEM, it's a naming convention, probably the most, the biggest one right now. Uh, it it's it has like three parts. The block is the name of the component. The element are the little pieces of it has into it, and modifiers if the block or the elements have a variation from the code is asked to name it. Okay, this is an example, the block, an element into a block. You can't nest it more. You can go block element, element. Maintain it simple, and then the modifiers. This is an example of BEM. The classic media card. It has the namespace I've been talking before. Just this is a molecule. Media, it has a container, usually to create the context. This is a link. Everything is clickable here. It has the image and the title. The title has a modifier. For example, if you want to modify the color in some cases or font size. This is an example in the CSS. For example, the Maya title, font size 1.5 rem, color red. But the modifier creates the color black. And finally, the ITCSS from Harry Roberts plus Atomic Design. ITCSS is really nice to manage the dependencies tree, to understand the CSS, to be completely self-explanatory. And it's really nice for the browser because you're never nesting elements, you are just writing the CSS for the browser. It has a lot of layers. The settings and tools are part of the SAS or less. The settings you will create the variables, the font sizings, the scale of everything, margins, paddings. Tools are the functions and the mixins. And after that, you have the rest of them. I'm going to explain the slider. As we said before, is made for the browser and for the dependencies tree. So imagine this is the line 0 of CSS. This is the latest one. It has at the beginning of it the most general classes of CSS. For example, the reset, the box sizing, the basically that, and that's in the generic file. So you will have just the reset and the box sizing and elements like this one in here. Elements, I don't really like that. I usually reset H1 to H6. I have everything with a reset on it. But some people uses it for example, the exactly that, the H1 to H6 styles, a link without a class, it's just everything in there. And right after that, organisms, molecules, and atoms. Always trying to maintain that low specificity, not nesting elements, not trying to use the same CSS before, just trying to override it. And at the end of it, we always had trumps. For example, if you need a hack or something like that, we're trying to keep it here at the end of it, so we know exactly what we're doing wrong. Okay, again, Use single level deep classes. This is really, really, really important. Um, some people try to nest elements or try to use IDs or try to basically that. Try to use an ID, then H5, then a class. Try to avoid that. Keep it simple. Just the class, anything else. Avoid IDs, avoid attributes, avoid complexity, everything. Just try to use single level deep classes. You can nest it, but try to avoid it. And whoa, it was too fast. Namespacing. As I said before, we used namespacing for all the classes. Actually, another one, layout, because we had a web app and the rest of the webs were just typical e-commerce with a sidebar. So we used the layout template to create the entire ecosystem for a web app. And the other one is the state of the component and has a state of the component. This is typical in CSS, SMAX. I'm not sure right now, but we just have just to create interaction with JavaScript. For example, a dropdown, when you click on it, we just add to the class the is active, for example. Hacks, everything on trumps, just to say, okay, this is a hack. I don't want to use it in the rest of the CSS. QA hooks, JavaScript hooks, AB hooks. Basically, this is all. It was really fast today. Do you want to? I don't have anything else. But we're really fast.
Is there any questions?
Yeah.
Questions?
Sí.
One second, please.
How many people do you usually work with?
I didn't hear you. Excuse me?
Hello?
How many people do you usually work together at the same project?
It depends on the project. In the major project, they were like, in the UI development, 3 or 4, but the rest of the team, architecture, the backend, like 60 more or less. And the rest of the teams, they were like 12 people, 10 people, it depends. But the biggest projects were like everything went like really slow because of course a lot of people, a lot of money involved. So the little teams were more agile, more kind of better. Yeah.
Okay, so I have another question. You mentioned about always using, sorry for everyone turning now. You mentioned it that we should always use just one single class, and I do agree with that. However, I've found myself that when you want to style things like inputs, which depend on the type, if you have to add a class every single time you create an input with text, that becomes a hassle. So where would you think that you should draw the line between when using an attribute and it's part of the base and when you should use a class and not use? So other example, for example, is A's that have an href.
Yeah. Well, you have to be a bit pragmatical or practical. If it's going to be easier to the entire UI, go for it. But usually I write the classes, even each element of a list, for example, lead, blah, blah, item, over and over again, because it's going to be easier to control that CSS. I have the entire component, I have the item in the CSS, I know how it works. Other ways, for example, just using the I have the media, for example. Have the media element, but I will have into it 100 links, like a list. Okay, so I can take, for example, media container and use all the A classes into it to do this. But for the browser, it's quite worse, because if you do something like this, I'm going to one moment. Give me 1 second. You have something like well, something like this. The browser will search all the A in the entire DOM. Ah, I'm sorry. You have something like this. The browser will look after all the A's in the DOM, all the CSS DOM, and after that, he will search for the M media. So for the browser, this kind of things is well worse for performance, or something like this. So if you can do something like this, or directly something like this, is going to be faster for the browser. Probably in a typical UI, less than 100 kilobytes in the UI, it doesn't matter, but in big UIs, it can be a problem. Anything else?
Do you have a way to tell apart class names or classes that target specific media queries? For example, modifiers that only affect certain media queries? Do you namespace them or use something to tell them apart?
No, I don't use that. I just create the media query for the component, and into it the modifier. And I didn't have because we are with Atomic, we are really creating small components based on visual patterns. So in the SAS file, you just have a little piece of code. So the media query is into it to write something in there. Yeah. Anything else? Okay. Well, thank you.